So, what does precariousness mean to you, do you think?
Precariousness is a really tricky concept, but I think it's a really important one. A lot of people are more vulnerable to, how could I say it? A lot of people experience precariousness as the likelihood of something going wrong for them that they won't be able to easily recover from. So I guess it's to do with ideas about social capital. You might not have access to people that can help you. You might not have access to emergency funds. You might be more likely to lose your home or other aspects of life that make life easier for you because you've got less financial stability.
What sort of resources, what sort of social capital do people draw on in order to resist precariousness?
In order to resist precariousness, people draw on networks very often. So they might draw on their kin, their friends, maybe sometimes their work in order to be able to be resilient in times of crisis. So we know that people who've got extended networks, if those networks have got finances, then they're able to help each other out. But if those networks are a little bit more precarious themselves, or if everybody has low financial sort of resilience, it's going to be much more hard for those people to survive that precariousness, to cope with that difficult situation. So sometimes people have work resources. Say, for example, in my job, I'm able to take a lot of sick leave if I'm sick, or if I'm suffering from domestic violence where I work, I can call on resources from work that'll help me, like counselling, time off work, that kind of thing. Not everybody has that, so that makes it really difficult for some people.
So you're talking then there about dealing with contingencies,
yes,
unpredictabilities and things like that. So beyond monetary resources, how do you think, I mean, can you think of examples of societies which haven't necessarily been affluent but have been able to deal with contingencies in certain ways?
So classic ways that Aboriginal people in Australia deal with contingencies and difficulties is by drawing on their kin networks. Large extended families that are able to help each other out, both socially, emotionally, with childcare, with all those other kinds of non-financial needs, are really helpful to people, and that is a big part of why people are very connected to their social networks in Aboriginal Australia.
And how have those means of dealing with precariousness been challenged or put under pressure by recent reforms to welfare systems?
Okay. In Australia, there have been reforms to welfare systems which have made it really difficult for people to deal with precariousness. And some of that is around some of the things I've been researching, like crowding in housing. So people who aren't able to offer accommodation to kin who might need it makes things really difficult for both sides. Kin feel that they want to support their families, but they're unable to because of rules around how many people you're allowed to have in the house. So that makes it really difficult to offer support, and it really makes it really difficult to find support. People don't want to put their tenancy at risk, but also they don't want to put their family at risk by asking for support that could get them into trouble with, say, state housing. So it's really difficult when people find themselves in that situation.
God, fantastic. And I mean, thinking about the migration of people, obviously there's been this trend throughout industrialising societies of people migrating to cities. So what sort of family networks do you find in the same sort of housing area? Where do people come from?
In cities in Brisbane, a lot of people who haven't traditionally lived in Brisbane often congregate together around social housing, but they also try and congregate near to kin when they're living in cities, even if they're not originally from that city. This helps them to be more resilient. This helps them to resist precariousness, but it also means sometimes you can be congregating disadvantage. That probably didn't answer your question very well.
No, that was good. That was actually really good because it sets up the second point, which is there's always this big concern, it seems, in government and also generally broader mainstream Australian cultural concern about kin networks dragging people down. I mean, so the classic example of the Aboriginal house, which has just been smashed up and all the rest of it. I suppose what am I trying to get at? Can we how might we understand how that has developed and how those communities can uphold the kin networks and the means that they've traditionally have had of dealing with precariousness, while avoiding some of the harms? I don't know.
Okay, so there's a really important point about kin networks in Australia. Some people think that Aboriginal kin networks drag people down and that they are a problem because you're going to end up with lots of people in your house, you're obliged to provide food for them, you end up with a chaotic, dysfunctional house. That's the stereotype. My reading of the situation is quite different, and that kin actually provides support and strength for people. They need that and they support each other, and it's usually not about dragging each other down, but it's about providing support and resilience. So reinterpreting that in a positive way, that people would actually have more opportunities to gain work, have accommodation, share childcare, share food resources, all those kinds of things are really important factors in thinking about housing and thinking about how people use their kin networks and why they use them. Another really important factor that I've learned about in my research is that households want to support each other. They see that as a strength, they see that as a cultural value, and that's partly what defines their Aboriginality. They think that it's really important to be not a selfish, mean, greedy person with only a couple of people living in a house, but a household is functioning more properly when there's a lot of people there, when you're supporting each other, when you're sharing and caring. And that's a really important factor to remember. So if households were well set up, if state housing was designed to cope with large numbers of people, then the scenario would be absolutely fine. Often the scenario isn't fine, not because of the people living in the house, but because the house isn't designed to cope with large numbers, even though we know that large numbers are going to be living in that house. So it's really a failure of the design. It's a failure of the system to meet the needs that we know are there in Aboriginal communities. And we could solve these problems by providing more appropriate housing, more culturally specific housing that would fit not only Aboriginal communities but a lot of other communities that use public housing in Australia.
Brilliant. So is this poor design intentional, or is it just, is it an intentional attempt to settle people in a particular cultural way to engender assimilation, basically, or is it just mere ignorance of cultural difference?
The design of Aboriginal housing has been experimented with for a long time, and I think to begin with there was a lot of really well-intentioned architects and designers who were trying their best to work out how to fit a culture that wasn't Western into a Western style house, or into a house that provided the amenity that traditional Aboriginal housing didn't provide. So we know that Aboriginal people lived in their vernacular housing for thousands of years and it was fantastic for them. But of course, it didn't provide the kind of waterproofing and the kind of amenity that we now know gives people better health, better outcomes in terms of being able to hold down a job, all those kinds of things. So housing today, there is some really good housing for Aboriginal people out there, but it's not the norm. A lot of Aboriginal people, of course, live in cities, and there isn't very much specific Aboriginal housing in cities. So there is the norm of the 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom, typical Australian house that has been rolled out since the 1950s, and that's what most Aboriginal people in state housing live in. And I'm not quite sure why that design persists. I think it's because it's cheap, because it's a norm that the government is comfortable with, and also because it doesn't stray away from the designs that we've had rolling out forever. It's easy, and in fact governments are moving towards more standardisation of housing rather than less. It's seen as expensive, and to a certain extent governments are worried about the idea that if they provide, say, a 6-bedroom house with 2 bathrooms and 2 kitchens, then that's going to look really fancy and expensive, right? And they don't want to look like they're privileging somebody who's going into state housing, so they say 3 bedrooms, it's 1 bathroom, it's basic housing. It's, I guess, playing into this concept of the deserving or the undeserving poor. Should we be giving people a lot of stuff that they might not necessarily deserve?
That's an example of a path dependency, a harmful path dependency, where government's just become adhered to a particular idea and has tried to, persist with that idea, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, and try to shoehorn people into a model which just does not fit.
I think you could call that model a bit of a problematic model. I'm not sure whether it's a path dependency model, but I think it's certainly a model that is problematic, and it seems to come out of partly our political cycles, where governments want to achieve something quickly within a 3-year term so that they can say, we spent the money and this is what we achieved, X number of houses, rather than saying we provided a long-term solution for this. So I'm not sure that there's much, as you would need in Australia, bipartisan support to provide long-term solutions that are investigating housing long-term, looking at why housing does or doesn't work, doing post-occupancy evaluations, doing really good in-depth studies. There's not a lot of that. So there's a focus on the quick fix, so that if we build a certain number of houses, then we've fulfilled our obligations.
Okay, all right. So you focused on various different communities in and around the Brisbane area.
Yes.
And in particular, obviously, we're going to be talking with Jermaine. Could you describe both the housing situation and the relationships between different cultural groups within Inala?
Inala is a really important community in public housing in Brisbane. It's got one of the highest concentrations of public housing in Brisbane, and therefore it's got one of the highest concentrations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Brisbane, because a lot of people in that category are dependent on public housing. So even though you've only got about 9% of the population there being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, that's a huge concentration compared to the overall population of Brisbane, which is around 3%. But of course, then you've got a lot of other populations that also rely on public housing living in Inala. You've got a big Vietnamese population that came in after the Vietnam War, and more recently you've got Pacific Islander and African migrant groups moving into Inala. So it's a very multicultural area, which gives it a lot of strengths, but also because you've got new people moving in all the time that are coming from a position of precariousness. You also have a lot of issues dealing with those new communities and supporting them.
I mean, it's quite common for people to talk about an Aboriginal culture, right, as being continent-wide.
Yes.
But they're very, very different cultural backgrounds for people who identify as Aboriginal from throughout the continent. And people have very, very different experiences of engagement with colonialism and settlement and all those sorts of things. Could you just provide like the briefest overview, the most simplistic overview of that heterogeneity of Aboriginal society?
Yeah. So contemporary Aboriginal society is very diverse. You've got a lot of Aboriginal people living in cities in Australia, but of course a really significant minority living in remote rural parts of Australia that are very isolated. Often when people think of Aboriginal Australia, they think of those remote rural red desert communities in the Northern Territory, but a lot of people live in towns and cities between Cairns and Sydney, along that eastern seaboard, with the biggest populations being in Sydney and Brisbane. Within those cities, you've got a really diverse group of people. You've got the emerging Aboriginal middle class, but you've also got a large number of people who are still experiencing a huge amount of disadvantage. That's a hangover from these colonial practices that we're still dealing with in Australia. So from people being dispossessed of their land in the early days of colonisation, to the missionisation era and the reserve era, where people were prevented from travelling, where they were sent out to forced work basically, and their wages were kept in trust, which of course ended up not being kept in trust and leading to the whole stolen wages phenomena, which really hasn't been resolved. That has really left Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities with huge structural disadvantages. So wealth hasn't been transferred across generations because people weren't allowed to buy houses, they weren't permitted to work, a lot of different experiences. So you've got some people who have never experienced work because their families have this history of missionisation and subsequent welfare dependency.
Yeah, okay. So in one sense, the common criticism of Aboriginal people is just work shy, degenerates. It's just bizarre in the context of they're actively being prevented from acquiring wealth. And
absolutely. Aboriginal people were prevented from acquiring wealth for decades in Australia. When they worked, their wages were held in trust and were never returned to them. They were prevented from owning property. They were prevented from undertaking a whole lot of the activities that everybody else was allowed to undertake in order to increase their wealth. And of course, this made a lot of people distrustful of work and of the government. And so when the government turns around now and says, why aren't you working? Why aren't you following our advice? A lot of that is to do with the fact that they don't trust them very much, and this is because of the history of colonisation.
So one of the things that I've always found bizarre about particularly in the context of dealing with people who are working on Aboriginal affairs, but just more generally in Australia, has been the way in which white people are presented as being deeply homogenised. So would you be able to talk about the problem of homogenising white people, white experience, and some of the potential opportunity for understanding difference that this may provide?
Okay. So the idea that white people in any society form a homogenous group and that Aboriginal people are some sort of other that is also homogenous is really problematic for me. I don't believe it at all. We know that there are plenty of white people in Australia who also have similar problems to Aboriginal people in terms of population cohort, in terms of lack of education, lack of opportunity, lack of intergenerational wealth, inability to buy homes, that kind of thing. So we know that these problems exist, but there is this persistence of an idea that Aboriginal people are one group and white people are another, and that white people are all equally able to access education and intergenerational wealth, housing, that kind of thing. And we know that that's not really true. What that does is creates a big problem because it makes it seem like Aboriginal people are the problem, Aboriginal culture is the problem, rather than some of these structural disadvantages that I think are really causing problems in society. That can also apply to white people, migrant groups, all sorts of people in society. So we believe we have a culture problem with Aboriginal culture instead of thinking we've got a societal problem to do with equity across the board. So thinking about the similarities between Aboriginal cultures and other cultures that might have similar challenges, I think there's some common characteristics that you might find. And these are ways that people resist that pressure to conform because they're sick of it, basically. They don't like it and they're trying to resist it, but in a way that conforms to their cultural norms and supports their cultural values that they feel very strongly about. So kin networks is a really important one, staying in touch with family, even if that might mean giving up a job or moving somewhere to support people, going to live with somebody who needs help or assistance, or having someone come to live with you if they need that kind of thing. Another way is through this kind of humour that you might see, which is really common. So Aboriginal people have a particular style of humour where they put each other down a little bit and they put themselves down. They knock down big noters and they do that not only to show that that person shouldn't really be boasting, but to show that they wouldn't do that themselves. And they often do that in quite a gentle way. And so what they're showing is that those things, those monetary things or those things about success are not as important as those kin networks, which is really what's going to support you when times are tough, because they know that times will be tough at some point in the future. I found this also with, say, my family in the north of England, my husband's family, who have this same kind of humour. Anyone who gets too big for their boots gets a little poke in the ribs to remind them that really you're just part of this family, you're just one person, you're not as important. And they do it in a very beautiful way. And it's interesting that we see that kind of stuff on, say, TV or something in Australia, and we think it's really sweet when we see it in English humour. But we look at Aboriginal communities and we go, look, they're dragging each other down. They're not supporting each other. When really what they're trying to do is teach people to survive and to be resilient too. There's some really interesting writing about how this self-deprecating kind of humour teaches resilience in kids, that they're going to be challenged, and that they need to know how to deal with that. So there is this culture of challenging each other, and so that you can have a little kind of practice banter that will stand you in good stead when somebody who's trying to give you a hard time at Centrelink or some sort of welfare agency does it, you might have some kind of comeback, or at least know what that's going to feel like. So there's some stereotypes of Aboriginal people that say they've got a lot of kids, a lot of different partners, they haven't held down a proper job, that they're living a relatively, what might be seen as a relatively dysfunctional life. But I think that those kind of scenarios can exist in a lot of different communities, not just Aboriginal communities. And they represent perhaps the best somebody could do in this and in their particular life. It's not easy for everybody, given the upbringing that they've had and the opportunities they've had to live a sort of standard middle class life with a job and 2 kids all going off neatly to school in iron school uniforms every morning. That is not always possible for everybody. And it's, while individuals have agency over what they do, there's a huge structural kind of setting that might make things easier or harder for those people, and lack of support, lack of opportunities can sometimes tilt the balance so that it's more difficult to achieve those kind of middle class norms, much more difficult. And so a lot of people are doing the best they can given their particular circumstances.